In 1972, the Hawker Siddeley Trident is the pride of British aviation.
Rotate.
The Trident was a completely British-built aeroplane.
Undercarriage up.
It was the equivalent of having a sports car.
When BEA Flight 548
Look at the speed! Look at the speed!
falls from the sky moments after takeoff, the carnage shocks the nation.
It was so tragic that there wasn't anyone who survived.
It was the worst airline accident that Britain had ever experienced.
Takedown's got to be dead, Lama. Come on, move!
London's Heathrow Airport.
Line 548 requesting start.
The crew of British European Airways Flight 548 is completing final preparations for an afternoon flight to Brussels.
Looks like the weather's gonna give us a bumpy ride today.
Line 548 cleared for start.
Captain Stanley Key was supposed to have today off, but was called in at the last minute. Key is a former RAF pilot and one of the airline's most qualified captains.
Start, Master. On.
Captain Key had been on the aircraft for a long time, so he's very experienced, and if you expected to fly with him, you expected to fly to the book and to do it accurately with no arguing.
Many of the 112 passengers are business travelers, taking advantage of BEA's rapid service to Brussels. The jet-powered Trident can make the trip in just 45 minutes.
The Trident was really a competition for the propeller and the turboprop aircraft, which were much slower. So you now had an aircraft which was fast, it flew above the weather, and it was halving the time to European destinations, which was an enormous economic advantage to the airline.
It takes 3 pilots to fly the plane.
Droops down.
Jeremy Keeley is the co-pilot.
Flaps 20.
Simon Ticehurst will help monitor the instruments.
Engine 1 start.
Engine 1 start.
It was an immensely popular airplane because it was the equivalent of having a sports car. It had a terrific performance. It had very powerful controls, which were all hydraulic. It was a delight to fly once you've got used to it.
Today's flight is getting off to a slow start. The airline has told the crew to wait for some last-minute passengers. Another flight crew needs a lift to Brussels.
Have a seat, Captain.
There was over 30 years difference between Captain Key and the 2 other members of his crew. And this produces the natural differences you have between a generation. One who regards the others as old and stuffy, and one who regard the youngsters as being young and irresponsible. This produced a generational gap.
Line 548 ready for takeoff.
Line 548 cleared for takeoff.
548.
The captain calls for takeoff power.
Maximum thrust.
The Trident gets its name from its 3 rear-mounted Rolls-Royce engines. Second Officer Ticehurst monitors the plane's speed.
100 knots.
They can't lift off until they reach rotation speed. 139 knots.
Stopwatch on.
Meanwhile, Keeley keeps a close eye on the time. It's part of a special procedure designed to minimize aircraft noise over populated areas.
It's a very noisy engine with a particularly nasty crackle to it. So noise abatement would be an issue wherever it flowed.
Rotate.
Once they've gained enough altitude, they'll have to throttle back slightly to reduce the noise of the engines.
They've got to adjust the power, i.e. reduce it, just when it would be really rather nice to keep the full power on. But they've got to reduce it for noise abatement reasons.
Officials at the airport measure the noise level after 90 seconds. If the pilots get it wrong, they'll have a black mark on their record.
The pressure on you is to do it quickly and to do it accurately.
Undercarriage up.
$60.
As the plane climbs, passengers are rocked by turbulence.
It was a gusty day, and gusty days give you a bumpy ride.
Left heading 145.
Heading 145.
The plane's flight plan calls for a left turn just after takeoff, taking it east of the town of Staines before it flies on to Brussels.
Beeline 548 climbing as cleared.
548 airborne at 09. Good day.
Roger.
Keeley prepares to throttle back the engines. If he does it too soon, the plane won't have enough power to climb.
75 seconds.
He'll have just 5 seconds to get it right.
There is a lag in the time that the engines take to respond to that, and on occasions you can actually reduce the power by more than you intended, and it would take a while to actually get the engines to settle.
85 seconds. 90 seconds.
Keeley reduces power just in time.
Passing 1,500 feet.
The procedure goes well.
548, climb to flight level 60. Squawk 6615.
The tower clears them to a higher altitude.
Up to 60.
Then,
What was that?
the plane begins to lose altitude.
Look at the speed! Look at the speed!
The airspeed dropped quite rapidly. There was then a very high rate of descent. They were just passengers in their own aircraft.
The plane has crashed in an empty field just meters from the town of Staines.
I was at home with my baby of 12 weeks, and I heard a very loud thump.
Local resident Frances Castledine leaves her infant son with a neighbor and rushes to the crash site.
If it had gone another 50 yards, it would have hit the center of Staines, with the shops and the houses there.
Frances is a nurse. She immediately begins searching the wreckage for survivors.
I was very much afraid there was going to be a fire, because the vapor was very heavy in the air. And I had to decide basically whether I was going to go back home to my baby or whether I was going to go forward and help. But I had had a lot of intensive training in the accident and emergency department, and I really felt that I needed to be there.
Nearly everyone is dead, but Frances is able to help one survivor.
Can you hear me?
I did my best. I did what I could.
Hear me?
I manipulated his legs and put them into some wreckage splints with some bandages.
You're gonna be okay. Hey! Hey!
man's injuries are too severe. Despite her quick response, he soon dies.
It just was so tragic that there wasn't anyone who survived.
All 118 people aboard BEA Flight 548 are killed.
This accident was pretty horrifying because it was the worst airline accident that Britain had ever experienced, and BEA was reckoned in those days to be the kind of airline that just didn't have crashes, and this time they did.
Headline's got to be dead, Lama. Come on, move!
Flight BE548 en route to Belgium crashes in a field not far from Heathrow and only a few feet from houses in the main road.
News that a plane crashed and narrowly missed the town of Staines is soon the top story across the country. Within an hour, the news reaches Chris Pollard, a new investigator with Britain's Accidents Investigation Branch.
At the time that I arrived on the site, the rescue attempts had started big time, and the site was very, very active with people.
Investigators are struck by something unusual. In most accidents, momentum carries the wreckage forward after it hits the ground. The crash at Staines is different.
The tail had not moved very far from where it had initially struck the ground, and the rest of the aircraft probably hadn't moved forwards more than about 50 yards, which for such a heavy aeroplane is very, very little distance.
Nearby power lines tell part of the story.
The older investigators, they were pointing out the power lines which had passed over very, very shortly before the first impact point.
If you walked around the back of the remains of the tail unit, you could look backwards and upwards, and there were overhead high-tension cables. This told you really that the aircraft must have been coming down at a very steep angle in order not to interfere with the cables.
The undamaged wires and compact crash zone tell investigators that the plane fell to the ground suddenly and steeply. It's a sure sign that the plane stalled.
An aircraft stalls when it's flying too slowly to generate sufficient wind over the wings to give it lift. When that aircraft hit the ground, it was actually slightly nose up. It was falling through the sky like that.
An airplane can stall for many different reasons, from engine failure to pilot error. Pollard studies the wreckage in search of the specific reason for the stall. Every piece of debris is a potential clue.
You may come across something which is unexpected, at which point you have to try to explain it. It may prove to be a red herring. It may prove to be something crucial. How you do the salvage actually very much influences how easy you make things for yourself.
Hang on, will you?
You can, by careless salvage, make things incredibly difficult for yourself.
There's another challenge. In 1972, planes in the United Kingdom are not required to carry cockpit voice recorders.
The modern investigator is helped enormously in so many accident situations where a cockpit voice recorder is present, because it really does help you understand what was going on the flight deck. I think we forget how difficult this must have been to investigate.
Investigators will only have the information from the Trident's flight recorders. It will take time to recover and process that data. The rest of the debris is carefully labeled and sent to AIB headquarters in Farnborough.
All this has to get back to the hangar.
There, the plane will be put back together like a jigsaw puzzle, a process that could take months. The team has no time to lose. If there's a problem with the Trident, investigators need to know as soon as possible. There is enormous pressure to find the cause of the crash.
You have to recognize that the Trident was a completely British-built and British-engined aeroplane. Therefore, for British industry, it was very important that if there was anything wrong with the Trident, it should be found out and corrected.
The weather could provide an early lead.
There was a cold front about 30 miles away, and at the airport at the time, there was low cloud at about 1,000 feet.
Undercarriage up.
And there was moderate turbulence, which would vary rather like driving a car over a rough road.
In bad weather, storm clouds sometimes create powerful columns of air that can force a plane to the ground.
Extreme wind shear or something of that sort can lead to a stall.
Planes are especially vulnerable during takeoff. They're so close to the ground that pilots have little time to recover from the problem.
The aircraft had only just taken off and it was still pretty low. If a stall like this had happened at multiple thousands of feet, there would have been plenty of time to recognize what the problem was and to do something about it.
Investigators need to know just how severe the weather conditions were at Heathrow when the Trident took off. The AIB receives detailed meteorological reports from the day of the crash. They reveal that the turbulence simply wasn't strong enough to knock a plane out of the sky. Meanwhile, investigators turn their attention to the preliminary information captured on the Trident's black box.
The amount of recording on the Trident was the greatest amount of any airliner I was aware of at that time. It was very much state-of-the-art.
They focus on engine data, searching for any sign that the engines flamed out or lost power. A sudden loss of thrust could explain why the aircraft stalled, but the data shows the engines were working perfectly. The Trident climbed out with enough thrust to maintain a safe speed.
With regard to the engines, we were quite satisfied that there was no evidence of a gross loss of thrust.
Engine failure did not bring down Flight 548.
The stall happened very suddenly during a normal climb. The speed, although it was a bit lower than it should have been, it was not dramatically lower than it should have been. It should not have led to a stall.
At AIB headquarters, the engineers concentrate on piecing together the wreckage.
When you do a reconstruction for investigation, the best technique is to try to lay the wreckage out in plan form, so that in essence you know automatically if you're looking for a particular bit, you know where to go for it.
By testing the reassembled systems, investigators should be able to tell if there was a broken part or faulty mechanism that could have caused the stall. They soon notice a problem.
That can't be right.
A lever is set to an unexpected position. It's used to operate crucial lift devices on the wing, known as droops.
It could be seen that the droop lever was in the retracted position.
Droops are aerodynamic surfaces that can be extended from the front of the wing. They increase lift during takeoff to help the plane climb.
The front section of the wing was hydraulically powered and would lean and droop forward to give an extra curvature to the wing, and at lower speed that would give you extra lift.
Droops should only be retracted once the plane has enough speed to maintain lift without them. If one of the pilots pulled in the droops too early, it would have instantly put the plane into a dangerous stall. The discovery baffles investigators.
How on earth did somebody manage to retract the droop lever and nobody noticed that that had happened? And it didn't make a lot of sense.
There's no way to tell just by looking at the droop lever whether the crew moved it before the crash or if it was jostled out of place by the crash itself. It might even have been moved during recovery operations.
Hang on, will you?
We had the whole of the droop system laid out on tables in front of the wing.
To determine how the all-important lever was last moved by the crew, Pollard must carefully examine the cables connected to it.
The droop lever operated a cable system which went down to the drive motor and selected a position which the drive motor would drive to.
Retracted.
They determined by an examination of the wreckage that the droops had been retracted at impact.
There's no longer any doubt. Someone in the cockpit moved the droop lever. It's a troubling discovery.
As the awareness developed that there'd been incorrect operation of the droop lever, the inevitable question arose, well, who had operated it?
The deadliest aviation accident ever to occur on British soil was caused by pilot error. This prompts urgent questions about the mental and physical state of the crew.
Autopsies are always done on flight crews if they don't survive an accident. A very simple thing is they want to find out whether there was any alcohol or drugs in the blood of the pilots.
While pathologists search for a physical cause,
Put up the personnel records, will you?
investigators focus their attention on the pilot's history.
The technical investigation at Staines had to rule out technical causes of the accident. And when it had done that, it really needed to look at the performance of the crew. Why did they do what they did, or why did they not do what they may have done on the day?
They study the captain's previous flights. He has an impeccable reputation.
Captain Key was a very experienced Trident pilot. He had over 4,000 hours, and he was an experienced captain as well.
His climb-outs from Heathrow are almost always flawless.
Undercarriage up.
But on the day of the crash, he does things differently.
Let me see those airspeeds from the day of the crash. Thanks.
Beeline 548 climbing as cleared.
548 airborne at 09. Good day.
Roger.
As he flew out of Heathrow, Key was flying the Trident a bit slower than usual.
On this occasion, from almost immediately after takeoff until the accident had occurred itself, there was a noted disparity between the speed that he should have been aiming at and the speeds that he was actually achieving.
It's an intriguing clue. This is not the way Captain Key usually climbs out after takeoff.
The performance at low speed was quite critical. The aircraft relies on its speed to provide lift. That means particularly close to the ground, it has to be flown very accurately.
Put up the photo of Key.
Key's normal performance came up to normal standards, but this on the day was well below standard. So they looked for reasons why this might be so.
Now the tray table from the wreckage.
A piece of wreckage points to a possible explanation.
In the sort of engineers area, there was a little table, and on that table there was some graffiti scribbled which gave a few rather facetious comments, obviously from a pilot who'd been sitting in that position.
Bloody fools.
It said Key must go, and then a few other derogatory comments added as well.
Could you hand me the photograph?
Graffiti found in the cockpit hints that the crew wasn't getting along. Perhaps a poisonous atmosphere in the cockpit made it difficult for the pilots to do their job.
Lights up.
Investigators looking for any kind of clue that tells you about perhaps the atmosphere within the airline or within the crew on the day.
Could you get this over to handwriting analysis for me, please?
Was it particularly tense? Was it particularly aggressive? And these are small factors that might give a clue to that.
If handwriting analysis can identify who wrote the graffiti, investigators may be one step closer to understanding what really happened in the cockpit of BEA Flight 548. Investigators interview other BEA pilots to find out all they can about Captain Stanley Key and his crew.
I hear you're someone we should talk to.
Yeah. I need to tell you what happened.
Pilots at British European Airways are on the verge of a strike. Captain Key is seen by many as a company man.
There was work to rule going on. Most of the co-pilots, which included me, were working to rule, and he thoroughly disapproved of this as not being a professional way to behave and was leading a campaign against it.
According to witnesses, things came to a head 90 minutes before the flight to Brussels.
I'd say it was just a couple of hours before the flight when it all happened. Captain Key? I hear the battle's starting to go our way.
What did you say?
I just meant that...
You know that during the war we flew in real battles?
Captain Key was very, very angry, felt very passionate this strike should not go ahead.
Like some selfish, pampered, immature crybabies making a lot of ridiculous demands.
Look here, just because your lot flew in the war...
And as for your refusal to...
Witnesses describing Captain Key's outburst at this other pilot described it as being just exactly that. It was a real outburst, a tirade.
You ungrateful bastard! If you're flying that plane for money, then you're in the wrong profession.
I think we better agree to disagree.
Bunch of fools.
The argument is so severe that investigators consider an unusual theory. That the captain's agitation interfered with his ability to fly the plane.
Bloody fools.
548, climb to flight level 60. Squawk 6615.
Distracted and angry.
Up to 60.
He might have pulled the droop handle without thinking. The multiple warnings would have added to his confusion.
If you go from what is apparently a normal flight into something which is seriously dangerous, it will produce a shock response. And that means your ability to think clearly and to act decisively is very difficult.
When you've got that queued up, let me listen to it, will you, please? Thanks.
Although the Trident is not equipped with a cockpit voice recorder,
Beeline 548, ready for takeoff.
the captain's conversations with air traffic control are recorded.
Beeline 548, clear for takeoff, 28 right.
548.
The human performance investigators trying to understand a simple thing. What was going through the mind of the crew at the time of the accident? Why did what happened make sense to them at the time?
Beeline 548, climbing as cleared.
548 airborne at 09. Good day.
Roger.
They immediately notice something unusual.
Captain seems awfully quiet.
548, climb to flight level 60. Squawk 6615.
Up to 60.
The captain's infrequent radio calls are so short, they don't even meet aviation standards.
For a proper response, if you are given a clearance, you have to repeat it back with the call sign of the aircraft. That was all missing.
Inadequate responses are out of character for this strict captain.
With hindsight, you and I might make a judgment about the way Captain Key was feeling at the time, that he felt he was under stress or very busy or having to concentrate very hard, or maybe all of those.
The conversation with the controller provides no hint about why the captain is stressed. Investigators are left with yet another question.
What was going on in that cockpit?
Stress takes many forms. It can be physical stress or it can be anxiety, perhaps caused by, in this case, an argument. And all of those things will add workload to our brains and reduce our ability to deal with things.
Results from the handwriting analysis are in.
These are similar C's on the BOAC and on license.
Discovering who scrawled graffiti in the cockpit could be the break investigators need.
A simple enough letter that could be.
The sample is similar to the co-pilot's handwriting.
There's more of those D's.
But experts conclude it's not a match.
They never positively identified the handwriting and the graffiti as definitely being one of the pilots who was in that crew.
It's another dead end. Investigators are no closer to understanding why BEA Flight 548 ended in tragedy.
Right, could you show me some of the switches on the Trident here?
Desperate for leads, they travel to BEA's flight simulator outside London. The team hears about a nagging problem for pilots of the Trident plane. The handle used to retract the droops is nearly the same shape as the one used to adjust the flaps.
I can see why you confuse them.
One has to bear in mind that it's being moved by the palm of the hand, and it's not easy to identify one from another.
E-line 548 climbing is cleared.
It's the co-pilot who's supposed to raise the flaps after takeoff.
548 airborne at 09. Good day.
Roger.
But the third pilot sometimes helps out.
85 seconds.
The noise abatement procedure added to the pressure. If the flaps were already up, it would be all too easy to pull in the droops instead.
There were circumstances under which it would be possible quite easily to retract the droops early, and that could be catastrophic.
If their theory is right, investigators should be able to find other cases where pilots made the same mistake. The team reviews the flight records from nearly 100 other Trident flights.
It's not just this crew.
They find 2 near accidents where pilots pulled in the droops by mistake. It's suddenly beginning to look like the captain's argument in the crew room had nothing to do with the accident. Poor design may be the real cause. Then comes news that puts investigators on an entirely new path.
In Captain Key's routine medical examinations before this, nothing was reckoned to be wrong with his health. It was only after the accident, when an autopsy was carried out, that it was found that he actually had some severe coronary problems.
There was medical evidence showing that the captain had suffered of a heart condition. It seemed to be the missing link.
Although the captain's heart problem did not show up in his regular medical exams, he had a deadly condition.
Now, as you can see, here
Key had, without even knowing it, a clogging of the coronary arteries.
this in turn caused the heart.
What did you say?
Do you realize that during the war we flew in real battles? I'd like to pampered.
Pathologists believe that Captain Key suffered heart failure sometime within a 2-hour window before the crash.
That is totally unprofessional.
It may have been caused by a sudden rise in blood pressure.
And you ungrateful bastard!
Captain Key may not have had symptoms of a heart condition prior to the accident, but following a stressful event, perhaps after the argument, it seems to have started to have an effect on him.
Bloody fools.
The theory could help explain the captain's unusual radio calls.
Beeline 548, clear for takeoff.
548.
Climb to flight level 60. Squawk 6615.
Up to 60.
If Captain Key was in enough pain, he would have kept his replies as short as possible. His discomfort might even explain why the droop lever was pulled too soon.
His level of pain would have increased over the period up to a point where he would have become partly or totally incapacitated.
Anything from what may feel like heartburn or indigestion through to a violent pain close to death.
If you're flying that plane for money, then you're in the wrong profession.
Finally, investigators have a possible explanation for what happened in the cockpit of Flight 548.
Bunch of fools.
If his blood pressure was particularly high because he was agitated, it might affect his reasoning, because if you have the oxygen level in your brain reduced, even slightly, it affects your alertness and your ability to reason. And the accident investigators reckoned that that may well have been so in this case.
Right, so we have to comb through all the information.
There's still a nagging question. There were other qualified pilots in the cockpit that day. Why didn't one of them do something to save the plane? The second captain seated in the back was too far from the controls to be of any help. But the two co-pilots could have responded to the crisis.
Neither Captain Key nor the other pilots realized that it was the retraction of the droop which had caused the stall, because nobody attempted to put it back down again. If they had done, they could have unstalled the aeroplane.
Jeremy Keeley.
Crew records provide a possible explanation. Because of the labor dispute at the airline, pilot training had been disrupted. Both the co-pilots on Flight 548 are very inexperienced.
What was that?
In the right-hand seat, his first officer had less than 30 hours of experience on the Trident.
There's obviously some opinion that these pilots were too young, they needed more experience.
The junior pilots may have been distracted by having a guest in the cockpit, or they may have simply not known what to do. Investigators believe there's yet another piece to the puzzle.
It all comes back to that argument.
Pampered crybabies making a lot of ridiculous demands.
Now look here, just because you're
And
not
as for your
through the
refusal to fulfill all of your duties,
Investigators learned that an hour and a half before takeoff, co-pilot Jeremy Keeley witnessed Key's outburst. They suspect it made a big impact on the young pilot.
Having witnessed an outburst like that, one can only surmise that if you are new to the fleet, you don't know the captain, you're slightly unconfident yourself, you may be nervous you're in performance, this is not likely to enhance it, and I would expect it would have been quite intimidating.
Shaken by his captain's temper,
Bunch of fools.
Keeley may have been more likely to make mistakes and less likely to correct his captain's errors.
It would certainly reinforce the concept that the captain was authoritarian and not somebody that you should challenge lightly, especially on that day.
There is yet another mystery. Investigators know that the Trident is equipped with a safety system known as a stick shaker. If a plane's speed drops too low, the control column begins to shake, giving the crew a dramatic warning that their plane is about to stall.
It will shake the column very distinctly and produce an unmistakable rattling noise at the same time.
Pilots are trained to react to the stick shaker by pushing the nose of the plane down to gain speed and increase lift. If that doesn't work, the system has a fail-safe, the stick pusher. It will move the controls forward to push the nose down, even if the pilots don't.
The pusher would make sure that firmly the aircraft's nose was lowered into an attitude where the speed would increase and you would recover.
Why didn't the system prevent Flight 548 from stalling and save the lives of everyone on board? Investigators study flight data from BEA Flight 548, searching for any sign that the plane's anti-stall system failed.
So it looks as though it came on here and here, but didn't stay on.
The data shows that the stick pusher did engage, but it didn't stay on long enough to prevent the crash. The finding can be explained in only one of two ways. Either the stick pusher malfunctioned, or the crew disabled it.
The stall recovery system was capable of being inhibited if they concluded that the thing was operating incorrectly.
To figure out what actually happened, engineer Peter Coombs has to test every electrical connection in the system.
Fortunately, the incident sensors had actually survived the accident in an apparently undamaged state. And there were a number of other components to the system, and they were tested and found to be operating accurately.
Coombs' test results point to a stunning conclusion. The plane's anti-stall system was working perfectly, but for some reason, perhaps because they didn't think their plane was actually stalling, one of the pilots disabled it.
By pulling out the stick pusher, by disabling it, they took away the natural stall recovery of the airplane and took the aircraft back into the stall. And after that, they were doomed because the aircraft didn't have enough height left to recover from the stall.
It now seems the crash of BEA Flight 548 was the result of a tragic combination of factors. First, a looming strike that led to an argument.
Making law with ridiculous demands.
Look here, because you're...
And as for your refusal to...
A heart failure that was possibly triggered by the fight, confusion over control levers, and co-pilots too junior or too intimidated to step in when things started to go wrong. For investigators, each piece of the chain is as important as the other.
Trying to solve something that's enormously complex, there's likely to be lots of small factors that influence any accident, no one simple thing.
After the crash, authorities implement a number of changes designed to prevent similar accidents from happening again. Handles on the Trident and other planes are redesigned to eliminate the possibility of confusion. Cockpit voice recorders are now standard equipment in almost all commercial passenger planes.
Somebody, and we're never quite sure who it was among the crew, somebody retracted the troops early, and the conclusion of the investigators in this case is that they could more likely have determined who was doing what in the cockpit if they had been able to judge what the pilots were saying to each other.
Cockpit voice recorders provide a major source of information for nearly every crash. But some experts don't think the recorders are enough.
Listening to a cockpit voice recorder rather resembles watching a television program with the picture switched off. It's quite difficult to work out what's going on, and on a flight deck, a lot of communication is by gesture.
One of the recommendations for flight decks now to help investigators is that there should be permanent filming of what happens on the flight deck. It doesn't have to be widescreen filming which shows what the pilots are doing and how they drink their coffee, but literally a narrow focus lens which looks at the controls that they handle and all the flight instruments.
So far, there are no legal requirements for the new technology, but some aviation authorities promote the voluntary use of cockpit image recorders. In the years following the crash, Hawker Siddeley faced growing competition from rival manufacturers. Trident production ended in 1978.
It was being challenged by the Boeing 727, which had a similar layout, 3 engines in the tail, and in some respects had slightly superior performance.
But the legacy of the Staines disaster lives on.
The accident drew into perspective the whole importance of human factors on the flight deck.
Bloody fools.
Nowadays, the way that crews interact together is taken very much more seriously.
The modern airline is operated very, very differently. The way that crews handle things has improved. It's a much better and safer world. The regret is we've had to build it on the death of 118 people.
Unlock the secrets of vast engineering projects designed to further Hitler's plan of conquering a continent in a Nazi megastructure's double bill tomorrow from 9.